Hello everyone and welcome to Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Paul Larson. Many Americans are preparing to celebrate Juneteenth next month, the annual commemoration of the end of slavery on June 19th. In 1865, that's the day Major General Gordon Granger ordered the final enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas at the end of the Civil War. Our community contributor Anna Channell speaks with a guest who runs a museum in the Adirondacks, one devoted to telling the story of how many enslaved people set out to leave bondage before freedom took hold.
When we think about the end of slavery in 1865, it can feel like distant history. But the truth is, that story lives right here in our community. The North Country played a powerful role in the Underground Railroad, with local churches and homes serving as safe havens for those making their final journey to freedom in Canada. Joining me today is Jackie Madison, president of the North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association, which oversees the North Star Underground Railroad Museum at Ausable Chasm in Chesterfield, New York. Jackie, thank you for being here with me today. I want to start at the beginning. What exactly is the North Star Underground Railroad Museum, and when did it open its doors?
The North Star Underground Railroad Museum is a museum that tells the stories of people who took this route to get into Canada or reverse to get back out of Canada. The Lake Champlain region was ideal in the sense that people could go through and there were people here to help them. It started with the formerly enslaved individuals who were escaping to get into Canada to freedom, and they were helped along the way by abolitionists and people in the area such as Stephen Key Smith, Wendell Lansing, Noadiah Moore. These are just some of the names of individuals who helped. Stephen Key Smith in Peru, Wendell Lansing in Keysville, and they would get them to Noadiah Moore in Champlain, who would take them over into Canada to get to freedom.
I was very fortunate to get a private tour with you recently, and something I realized very quickly when I was in the museum and looking over everything and you were telling me stories was how the Champlain line actually played such an important role in the Underground Railroad. Can you walk us through the significance of the Champlain line and what exactly that is and the routes that the slaves had to take to get here?
The routes vary, but the Champlain line was really anything that came up from the Hudson Valley area along Lake Champlain. In some cases, it could even be on the lake itself because there were captains of some of the boats that would hide formerly enslaved people on them and get them into Canada. But typically they would take whatever means of travel, foot, horse, train when it came about, and make their way up through the Adirondacks, sometimes crossing over into Vermont, then coming back over, maybe up around Rouse's Point, going over to Ogdensburg, and going over into Canada. But they made their route wherever it was the safest. And the Underground Railroad was not a railroad as many would like to think. It was actually a secretive network, sort of a physical version of the internet today, where people knew how to get people from one stop to the next stop to the next stop until they got into Canada.
So the displays in the museum are fantastic, and they focus heavily on specific individuals and their journeys, which is something that I found completely fascinating. One that stood out to me was the triumphant story of John Thomas. Can you share with us who John Thomas was and how he ended up actually owning a farm in the Adirondacks?
John Thomas was in Maryland. He was on the eastern shores of Maryland. He was, I'm sure, content until his wife and children were sold. At that point, he decided to escape, and he left with two other formerly enslaved people. He made his way up into Philadelphia with the help of the Underground Railroad and was able to move from Philadelphia to the Troy, Albany area. In Troy, Albany, he was able to meet Gerrit Smith. Gerrit Smith was a wealthy abolitionist. He lived in Peterborough. He owned over 800,000 acres of land, and he had a vision. He anticipated that he could help end slavery in New York if he could get enough men to vote to remove it. And his way of going about that was to actually give African American men 40 acres of land, because African American men needed land valued at $250 to vote. He would ultimately give away 120,000 acres to 3,000 men. The flaw in his plan, however, although he gave this land, the land wasn't the greatest. It was rocky, but he offered this land to people that had little resources to bring in tools to farm, and they were also people who needed to be trained and taught how to farm, many of them. However, John Thomas had lived on a farm, and he got his 40 acres and he moved up into the area. But by the time he got the land, he had married again, a lady named Mary Vanderhaven, and they had children. The land that Gerrit Smith gave him, it was too far from the schools and too far from church. So he sold that land, went back to Troy. He must have really liked this region, and he returned later and he purchased 50 acres of land in the town of Bloomingdale. And he would grow that into a farm of 200 acres. And he lived there in near Bloomingdale until he was in his 80s, and he passed away. And he has a rather lengthy obituary in the Malone newspaper. And the most interesting thing is that his family, he had family at the time that still lived in this area. They were unaware of that history until Don Papson, who was the founder of the museum, uncovered it. So I'm sure their family dynamics changed tremendously after that, yes.
It is fascinating. You also have several artifacts available for visitors to see in the museum, and you can see them close up, which is very cool also, such as the leg iron and the flax hackle. Those two stood out to me, and I left that day and I kept thinking back about them. The flax hackle tells the story of Lavinia Bell. Can you share a little bit about the torturous experiences that Lavinia went through?
Yes, Lavinia Bell was actually born in Washington, D.C. Her family was free, but when she was a child, she was stolen because slave catchers would take anyone that was black to get them into slavery. And she ended up in Texas on the farm of the Worrells. And Mr. Worrell was horrible. Not at first. When she was little, as a child, they had her to sing and dance, and she learned how to make animal sounds. And so she was a form of entertainment, I'm sure, for her guests and for them. But when she got older, they put her out in the fields, they took away all of her clothing, they cut her hair off, and she would do things like plow, she would pick cotton. Now, one of the tasks is that most slaves had quotas, so you had to pick a certain amount of cotton each day. If not, you were punished. One of the punishments was to walk across or stand on these flax hackle. And a flax hackle is just a thick piece of wood with these really long nails that's pounded through it. So can you imagine standing on or even walking across those nails? So she got a lot of pricks on the sole of her feet. She would escape, because who wants to be treated like that? Her and her husband escaped one time, and they were caught. And her husband was actually beaten so badly he died. She kept running away, and she escaped. One time she had a set of twins. One was stillborn. Another time she escaped, she was actually sold south by a black man. So all of this was around money. So anyone, she was vulnerable for anyone to take advantage of her. She would finally, though, escape, and she was able to do that because one of the times that slave catchers caught her and they took her back to Mr. World's, he had a hard time convincing the slave catchers that this was his slave. He does get her back, and he actually, I should say, he did get her back, and he actually punished her by putting slits in her ears. He cut off the finger, her little finger on her right hand, and he branded her on her hand and on her chest. And his wife was really upset that he did this to Lavinia. And so she told Lavinia to follow the North Star and pointed it out. And she was able to escape. And that time she was able to make her way up into our region. She made it to Rouse's Point, and there was a kind gentleman, probably seeing that she was kind of ill, paid her way into Canada, into Montreal. She gets to Montreal, and a black man, Mr. Cook, actually takes her in, and he has a doctor to come see her. And the doctor is really horrified. She has all these scars on her body. And he writes an article for the Montreal Gazette, and it goes in the paper, and she gets better. She actually ends up renting an apartment with another laborer, but in April, because she makes her way in January to Canada, and she ends up disappearing about 2 weeks after renting this apartment with this other laborer. And she disappears totally.
That was something when I was going through the museum, when we would talk about a slave, a lot of the time, once they got to Canada or they got to wherever they were trying to go, their story would almost kind of stop, and we were kind of left hanging.
Yes, and I'm kind of left hanging too, because it would be very nice to know how those individuals, what turned out for them. The way I would say is that I'd like to think that they made it into Canada, that they were able to find a place to stay, that they became part of the community, and that they kind of blended in and created their future generations there. But we don't know. We do know that some formerly enslaved individuals that did go to Canada came back to America after the Civil War, under the assumptions now that we are free.
And when you're welcoming visitors to the museum, one, if they get to hear your stories, it's incredible. I could have spent, I'm not exaggerating when I say days listening to it. So when you're sharing this museum and these stories with everyone that's coming in, what is something that you hope that they take with them when they leave after seeing, hearing, and feeling everything that you feel?
I hope they take away their story, the stories of these individuals and the trials and tribulations that they went through to actually get to where they got ultimately to freedom. Some of them did not, but at least they made the attempt. My hope is that they take away the fact that we're all human. We all want security, we want safety, and we want freedom to the extent that we can determine what we ourselves can do to make our lives better. And I think that's the most important thing.
The North Star Underground Railroad Museum has welcomed more than 50,000 visitors since opening in 2011. Through powerful storytelling and immersive exhibits, it reminds us that this history happened right here in the North Country and why it must never be repeated. The museum opens for the 2026 season Memorial Day weekend. For information and hours, visit northcountryundergroundrailroad.com.
To commemorate Juneteenth this year, the North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association is organizing a number of events and collaborating with other organizations. Events will include a photography exhibit, an Underground Railroad bus tour, a barbecue, a historical recitation, and a dance performance. The celebration this year begins June 19th and lasts until the 21st.